All right, welcome back to a freestyle training video. This is a continuation of our visual scripting crash course. We're working in Unreal Engine. This is class 2, and today we're going to be talking about variables. Now, as a quick recap, this course is all about helping fill in some of the foundational gaps that you might be missing if you've never had or you've never taken a scripting course or you don't have a traditional software engineering background. So as I mentioned, class 2 is all about variables, and let's see what we can do to build out some of these foundations. And we're going to start with looking at what the definition of a variable is. So if you were to search the internet, an example of a description that comes up for what a variable is a symbolic name that is a reference or a pointer to an object. Yeah, no, we're not going to use that. I want you to throw that out. That is absolutely awful definition. Just forget about that. It's not useful for creatives, and it doesn't tell me anything about what it is. So I want you to visualize a variable in a different way. And the way I want you to visualize a variable is I want you to think of it as a bucket. All right. And just like a bucket, a variable holds things. So a bucket could hold rocks, water, dirt, whatever you want. A variable bucket is the same thing. It can hold rocks, dirt, water, integers, characters, all kinds of different stuff. All right, so we have this bucket and it's holding stuff. Now, what would be cool to help us out is if we could know, for example, if you were holding two buckets and I asked you to give me something that was in the first bucket, how would you know which one that is? Well, the cool thing about variables is we can label them. So if we were to label our variable buckets, I could label one my first bucket, and I could label one the second bucket. And when I ask you, I could say, hey, give me what's in the first bucket, and you would hand me the rocks, or give me what's in the second bucket, and you would give me the water. Labeling our buckets is effectively the same thing as naming them. So we're naming our variables. So that's the second cool thing about variables. So we have these variable buckets. We can label or name them. Now, just like a bucket that stores water or rocks or whatever, it could also be empty. There might not be anything in the bucket. It's just something to keep in mind. And lastly, something that's special to Unreal. When we create a bucket, whether it holds rocks or dirt or a number or any of the other variable types we're about to talk about, Unreal wants us to specify what each bucket type is. So for example, if we had a water bucket, you could only store water in the water bucket. If you had a dirt bucket, you would only store dirt in the dirt bucket. So with that analogy in your head, a bucket a variable is a bucket that stores information. You can reach in, you can take stuff out of it, you can put stuff back into it. It could be empty. You can do all kinds of different things with it. Let's take this and let's hop into Unreal and let's apply this in practice. Okay, so here we are in Unreal Engine, but before we can actually apply our variable knowledge, our variable buckets, we need to learn a little bit about where we define variables. And we know a little bit, we've seen it before if you're working through our previous course. Just as a quick heads up, I'm continuing from our first class with our house example. And so I've just opened up my blueprint for my house. And before we get started, let's talk about where we define our variable buckets. Over on the left side in the event graph, you'll notice this section that says variables. Now in here, if we click on the plus sign, it'll instantly create a new variable called new var. And we're going to label this. We're going to call this my first variable. Let's call it that. Okay. Now, one of the things that you'll know, so we've already labeled our bucket. What we need to do is we need to specify what kind of bucket it is, what kind of information is stored in this bucket. And in this case, it defaulted to boolean. I don't want you to worry about this yet. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these in a second. But for now, let's change this. And this is the cool thing. When you click the drop down, Unreal is powerful. You can store almost everything in a variable. We're not going to talk about all of the things that you can do. We're going to use the basic ones as a means for us to build that foundational understanding of variables. So for now, let's define this as an integer. Now, for your reference, an integer is just a whole number. We're going back to, early math. We're talking 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and negative numbers as well. -1, 2, -3, -5, etc. And these are whole numbers like that you would use for the number of bullets, the day of the month, things like that, whole things. You're not going to have a day and a half, or you're not going to have 1.5 bullets, you're going to have 2 bullets, or etc. Things like that. So we've defined our variable. It is labeled or named my first variable. It is an integer, meaning it's inside our variable bucket called my first variable is a number, a whole number. And in addition, when we click on it over here on the left, you'll notice on the right, there's all kinds of default information. We can change the name of it, the variable type. We're going to skip all of these extra check marks because a lot of this is noise, and go all the way down to the bottom and talk about the default value. You'll notice that the default value says, please compile the blueprint. So if we compile our blueprint, you'll notice this updates. And now the default value for my first variable is 0. Okay, that is really good information. So we know that our variable bucket called my first variable has a value in it of 0 by default. Now let's test that. Let's see what that looks like. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to take our begin play and I'm going to disconnect it. And what I want to do is I want to print the value of what's inside that bucket. Now, if you recall, when we went back to our original description, we said we could put things in bucket and we could take things out of the bucket. Or we could get the value of what's in the bucket, or we could set the value of what's in the bucket. And that's the way Unreal names it. So if we drag my first variable out here into our blueprint, you'll notice that it says get my first variable and set my first variable. This is the action of getting what's inside the bucket, the value of what's inside, or setting what's inside. And we're going to do both here, but we're going to start with getting. So let's get the variable. And all I want to do is let's just print the string, print string. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag off of my first variable and I'm going to connect it to the string pin. Now, real quick, just so you don't get confused, this extra little node shows up. And if you bounce over it, it will tell you exactly what it's doing, so it's not a stress point. What it does is it converts an integer value to a string. The reason it does that is because in order to print, Unreal needs to print a string. A string is a sequence of characters. And so what that does is it takes whatever's in my first variable, the integer, converts that to a string so that Unreal can print it. All right, but the core important piece is we are getting what is inside the variable bucket, my first variable, and we are printing it out. So let's compile that and let's just press play. And you'll notice in the top left, the number 0 printed. Okay, if we escape out of that and we come back in here, we can make this a little bit longer. Let's go 4 seconds on this. And we'll just play again. And you'll see the number 0 in the top left for 4 seconds. So what we have done here is when we're playing, when we go into our blueprint, it begin play starts, then it gets the value of what's inside the my first variable bucket and it prints it. All right, so let's continue our example. Now let's set the value. Same thing. We're going to drag out my first variable and we're going to set the value. And the value that we are going to set it to is, let's just set it to 2. And then just like we did before, we're going to print this. So I'm just copying and pasting my print string. And now what we should see is we're going to come into this blueprint. We're going to begin play. We're going to get the value in the my first variable bucket. We're going to print it. Then we're going to set the value of what's in my first variable to the number 2. After we've done that, then we're going to get the value of what's in my first variable bucket and we're going to print it again. So what we should see is 0, and then 2. Because when we start, it's 0, then we change it to 2, then we print it, so we print 2. So let's take a look at that. All right, you'll notice that you see the 0, and then you see the 2. Cool. We're working with variables, y'all. Okay, now, you can get a whole lot fancier with this, but before we do that, let's take a quick break and talk about some of the standard variable types. So, as an example, let's create a new variable. And I'm going to call this second variable. Second variable. And this time, I'm going to set it to a float. But before I do that, we're going to talk about all of these cool, pretty colors that are available. So, first things first, let's go through some of the basic types. And we're going to be talking about the fundamental ones to start with. First, Boolean. You'll notice if you mouse over it, it tells you what it is, true or false value. So Boolean is literally true or false, and it's used to specify the state of something as being true or false. So for example, you could create a Boolean is jumping, is in air, is out of ammo, is dying, for example. At the end of the character dies and the character is dying. So basically, if the character is dying, you would set it to true. That's how you store that, true or false. Now, that's Boolean. We're gonna skip byte. If you mouse over it, it'll explain it. It's an 8-bit number, but for now, in general, for some of this foundation stuff, we're not gonna be using the bytes. An integer, we already talked about, -1, 2, -3, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. An integer 64 is just a really big integer. So generally speaking, I use integers most of the time. A float is a floating point number, or a lot of times if you're not familiar with the term floating point, it's a decimal number. So it has a decimal point in it. So 0.0, 1.1, and it's also negative, -1.1, -10.0. When might you use this? You might use this to control the blend of an animation. You might use this to control your health, the damage done, multipliers to different things, anything you might use a decimal for. Positions in space, scales of object, these are all floating points or decimals. Name, string, and text, these are all just a sequence of characters. They are used in different cases, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of workbooks on variable types. So we're going to finish this tutorial on variables themselves so you know how to use them, and then we'll do a couple for the ones that have some special things to them. So for example, we'll do some workbooks with booleans, we'll do some workbooks with names and strings and text, and maybe even some vectors as well. So these 3 are literally just about characters. The name of a character, the name of an enemy, the text that you want to display in a UI, those kinds of things. The next one is vector. A vector is, generally speaking, a 3-point position or value. So it could be XYZ, which is very useful when we're working in 3D and Unreal. It could be RGB when we're working with the values for color. But it's basically 3 values in one. And then these last 2 are Unreal specials. One is a rotator, which is a 3D rotation, and the last one is a transform, which is an even more complex thing. It has translation, rotation, scale all in one variable type. So if you were to look in a transform bucket, what you would get out would be translation, rotation, and scale. Now that we've introduced all of these, let's just choose float for this second variable and do the exact same thing we just did so you can see the difference between printing integers and printing floats. Now, just like our first variable, you'll notice over on the right, the default value says, please compile the blueprint. If we compile it, you'll notice right off the bat, second variable's default value is 0.0. If we click on my first variable, you'll see that it's 0, no decimal point. That's the difference. Now, if we want to get the value, same thing, we drag off and we basically left click drag off into space and we can get the second variable. And then from there, I can just print this, print string. If I drag off of this integer to this string, it will create one of our conversions. It's going to convert that decimal number or floating point number into a string so it can print it. That way the print string command understands what to do with it. And if we go ahead and set our color to something different, let's do a nice hot pink, and we'll keep our time to 4. We compile, we can save this, and we can run, and we'll see 0, 2, and 0.0. Perfect. So let's go back and let's set our variable. Exact same thing. Second variable, let's take it and let's set it, and we're going to set it to, what value do we want to use? How about 2.2? Then let's go ahead and print it, and I'm just going to copy paste, highlight these 3, Control C, come over here, Control V, and now what is going to happen is we're going to print our value again. So walking through this again, get what's in my first variable bucket. We're going to go look in the bucket, what value is in there when we start, the default value, which is 0. We print that. Then we set what's in the my first variable bucket, and we set that to 2. Then we get the value that's in there and we print it. So now it's printing 2. Then we get the value that's in second variable, which is 0.0. We print that. Then we set it to 2.2 and then we print it. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. Show you what's going on. We have 0, 2, 0.0, and 2.2. Everything's working perfectly. Now, in addition to being able to specifically set these variables, we can also do a lot of different things with them. And this is what I'm talking about. We may do workbooks, but for now, let's just keep it simple. And what we're going to do is I'm going to make some room here. And rather than setting this variable to, yeah, let's do that. Actually, let's do it on our floating points. So we'll take these. Okay, now I'm just going to copy this a bunch of times because I want to show you something. Well, let's start with once. Okay, rather than setting it to 2.2, we can set it to math, just general math things. So for example, if I wanted to, I could drag off this and choose, just type the multiply key, okay? And that's going to create a box for me. And I could choose to set my second variable to 2 times 5, not 0.5, 5. All right, 2.0 times 5.0 is 10.0. So this is now going to print 10. So we have 0, 2.2, then we're setting the second variable to 10, the result of the multiplication. And what we can do is we can do all kinds of different math with this. So in addition to multiply, I can also add. If I press the plus key, there's an add operator, and I can add 1 and 2, for example. You can subtract, you get the general idea. Subtract, add, multiply, all kinds of different things. You're going to be doing this as things happen. So for example, when a character shoots their weapon, you want to subtract a bullet so they don't have infinite ammo, as an example. So after they shoot their weapon, you're going to take the amount of ammo they have, you're going to subtract 1 from it, and then you're going to reset it to what the new value is. Now we haven't actually done that here, but we're going to get that into that in a second. So with this, now when we print, we're going to get all kinds of different things. We should get 0.0, 2.2, then we'll get 2.0 times 5.0, which is 10.0. Then we'll get 1 plus 2, which is 3.0. So let's just go ahead and run that. And you'll see we have 0, 2.2, 10, and 3.0. Awesome. Now let's go back to that ammo example I was talking about. Again, we probably wouldn't use decimals for ammo, so maybe it's shield time remaining as an example. Okay. So right now what we've done is we've just taken the second variable and we've just plainly set it. But remember, we can get the value of what's in the bucket already. So let's just take this and copy this and do one more. And what we're going to do is rather than setting second variable to 1 plus 2, let's set second variable to second variable plus 2. All right, now this is going to change some things for us. So when we look at this is important to understand. Ignoring everything in front of it, we're just going through the execution order. What happens here, and you can just read through it in sequence, we get the value of what's in second variable. At this point, second variable is set to 1 plus 2, which is 3. So here, we're going to get the value of second variable, which is 3. We're going to add 2 to that, which is 5. Then we're going to set the value of second variable to the result of that, which is 5. And then we're going to print second variable. So all we've done is we have created a way to basically quickly get what's inside of our bucket, inside of our variable bucket, use that, do some work with it, and then put it back in the bucket so we can use it again. Okay, so if we run this, we should see everything we saw before plus the last number of 5, which we do, which is perfect. Okay, now let's do one more thing and get to why we want to use variables. I'm going to take all of this and move it up and make some space. And what I'm going to do here is for everywhere I have a decimal, I am going to add in a multiply. Okay, so let's just do this. Let's drag off the pen and put a multiply and connect it up. Okay. So, and let's set the value to 2. So we're going to multiply all of our decimals after the default, right, by 2. So let's do this. So this is going to come in here and here. And we are intentionally making this laborious because I want you to understand the power of variables. Same thing here. Okay, so now what is going to print is what we had before, except everything is going to be multiplied by 2. So when we start, we have 0.0, 2.2, then we have 2 times 5, which is 10, multiplied by 2 now, which is 20. Then we have 1 plus 2, multiplied 2 by 2, which is 6. So we get 26, and then 6 plus 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, so we should get 22 and 16. Let's take a look at that real quick. You'll see 26 and 16. Let's double check that. Yep, this is the 6. This is the 16. So now let's say, and this is why we use variables. Variables is all about making our blueprints, our visual scripts, easier to maintain, easier to update, and easier to manage. Let's pretend that what I was doing was this multiplier, this 2.0, was an ability that gave me the ability to jump 2 times as high. But let's say I decided that that wasn't strong enough, and I wanted to update it so that now my character could jump 4 times as high. Well, now, in order to update this, I have to go through my blueprint, and I have to find everywhere I'm multiplying by 2.0 and update this. So I would have to come in here, I would have to go 4.0, find this one 4.0, find this one 4.0. Okay, 1, that's a pain. It's a maintenance nightmare. 2, it's error prone. I might miss one. So wouldn't it be cool if there was a way that I could just update them all at once? That's what a variable is for. This isn't too bad, there's only 3, but when your blueprints and your visual scripts get larger, you might be hunting through a lot of different places to find this. So rather than specifying 4, let's create a new variable called jump height. Okay, let's do this. Variable. And we're going to call this jump height. Jump height. And we're going to default, we're going to change this. We're going to default this one to 1 because generally speaking, you never want your jump height to be 0. I'm guessing. And then what we're going to do is we're going to connect this jump height in to this pen for our multiplier, pretending in our mind that rather than printing, we're jumping, as an example. So if I drag out here into our blueprint and I choose get jump height, you'll notice that it shows up and I can connect it up. Now, I want to show you another way to do that, which saves you a step. So now jump height is connected to our pen. Rather than dragging it and letting it choose get, etc. If I just drag jump height straight to this pen, you'll see a check mark shows up. It auto connects it for me. So that's a quick little tip to save you some time. We take jump height and connect it to our pen. Great. Now, at this point, we've created a new variable. This is a bucket that stores our jump height value in it, and we're multiplying all of our stuff by 1.0. So when we play, you'll see that it prints out our 10, 3, and 5. Cool. But then all of a sudden I realized, you know what, that's not powerful enough. I want the player or the experience to be able to jump higher. Rather than hunting through all this, I can just choose my jump height and I can just set it a default value now. Let's set it to 2. That's it, I'm done. So now I can press play and you'll notice that it's 26 and 16 now instead. Oh, you know what, that's still not enough. I'm gonna set it to 4. So I can change the default value or even, you know, kind of on par with the class. What we could do is here, we could set the value to 4. Connect it in as an example. Compile that, and now you'll notice that it's 4 times as much. And if I wanted to update that, I could just simply change this back down to 1.5. Anyways, you get the general gist. This is why variables are powerful. It allows us to quickly update many values spread all throughout our visual scripts in a very clean way that it helps us prevent a lot of problems from, you know, being error prone or missing one, and also just making the maintenance a whole lot easier. So this is kind of the basic example working with numbers. And in general, the exact same steps apply, whether it's a string or an integer or a vector or anything like that. Now, let's work through a vector example. And what we're going to do is I'm actually going to bring my begin play back down, and we're going to do the exact same thing. And what we're going to do at the end of our house, if we press play right now, you'll notice that our house shows up. You'll see it right there. What we're going to do is we're going to, at the end, let's put in a 1-second delay. And then what we want to do is we're going to scale our house. So I'm going to drag out my default scene root, which is in a way kind of a variable. It gives me the ability to work with, it gives me a handle, a reference to the default scene root. And I can set the scale. I believe it's let's set the world scale. First things first, let's just test this. Now you'll notice the scale has 3 values, X, Y, and Z. It makes sense. So let's just double it, see what that looks like. All right, and I want to show you a couple other things about variables before we wrap up today's class. You'll notice after a second, it pops up, it scales. Perfect. Okay, so let's do this a bunch of times. And we kind of recreate the learnings that we've got. So we're just going to take the scales and we're just going to basically do this. Just do 3, that's enough. All right, now, if we said that our first scale was 2 and our second scale was double that, we'd have to do 4. And then our next scale was double that, let's say 8. It's gonna be a really big house, but you'll get the general idea. Continuing on where we are, just a quick show. Let's see, we got 1 second, 1 second, it gets really big, okay? Now, if we take a look, this is already painful. If I realize, whoa, that's too big, what I need to do is I need a way to make it so that I can easily update all the houses. Well, If we drag off this pen, this is a vector, and a vector basically is an XYZ. It holds 3 decimals. If I drag off this pen, I can choose make vector. We're going to do this a bunch of different ways. So let's just start with this. Okay. Now, we can also do this. Make this 4. Now, so far, we haven't done anything special with variables yet. We're just setting up to be able to use variables. And then finally, this last one. We're going to do one other thing with this last one after the fact. But for now, let's just get this going. Okay, so now to use this as a variable, let's just create a variable. And there's a couple different ways that we could do this. We could create a variable, a simple float, and let's just do this both ways, just to hammer home the idea of reusing our variable buckets to help us save time. And we're going to call this a house scale. And it's a float, and the default value is going to be, let's say 1.0, for example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the house scale, and I'm going to multiply this by 2. Okay. And when I do that, I can now connect this in to all of these pens. And now what I get is a house scale times 2 is going to build this house. All right. So let's take this and copy it, do the same thing here. And instead of 2, we're going to multiply by 4. And then finally, over here, we will multiply by 8. So now what's happening is the exact same thing. We're going to get the exact same results, but the difference is now we're using a variable. So just to iterate, 1, 2, 8, bingo, big house, really big house. If we go back now, this is where the power of variable goes in. I'm like, that is too big. So let's just go half size. Let's go, or no, let's say quarter size. We'll go 0.25. So now, as it increases in size, it's going to be increasing by only a quarter. So it's going to start smaller, and it's not going to get nearly as big. So I have the ability to very quickly update my house scale for all 3 of these just by changing one number. That's where the power comes in. Okay. So we define a variable for that. That's one way to do it. Another way to do this would be, rather than making a vector, we could just define our scale as a vector. So let's create another variable. I'm going to call this house scale vector. And I'm going to set the type to be vector. And I'm going to set the default value to be 1. And then what we'll do is we can just take all of this. And I can disconnect it. I'm pressing the Alt key and left clicking to disconnect these. And now if I drag out my house scale vector, this is going to basically connect it up. And what I can do is, just like I can multiply decimals, floats, and integers, I can also multiply vectors. So if I just drag off this pen and I choose multiply, what I want to do, and this is a new thing in Unreal Engine, I think it was 5, they made this change. By default, when you multiply a vector, they're expecting another vector. So I could just do this like this. I could say 2.0, 2.0, just for clarity, 2.0, and do this a bunch of times. And just like we did before, this would be 4.0, 4.0, and 4.0. But there's another way to do it. And what I can do is I can multiply, and I can right click on this bottom pen, and I can say convert pen to a float. And when I do that, I can change that to float 0.8. That way I don't have to type it in 3 times. So you can multiply vectors by floats as well, just like you can in regular math. Now, this is the exact same thing that we had before, The difference is rather than house scale being a single number that we're feeding in and making a vector, it's already a vector to start with. So that does give me a little more control. So for example, right now this is going to do the exact same thing that the big one was doing. But now what we can do is we can do things like change different axes. So let's just say that we want the house to be half as tall, which is Z. So now what's going to happen when we start, it's going to be increase in size, but it's not going to be as tall. So we have control of all three axes now because we're using a vector instead. This is the power of vectors, of having these variable buckets for us to be able to put things in, take things out of, and use later. It allows us to maintain our scripts, our visual scripts, in a very clean way, update them easily, and helps reduce our errors. Now, there's a couple other things that are worth knowing about when it comes to vectors. So let's take, for example, and let's change the delay between each of the house builds as an example. If we wanted to, this duration, we could come over here and we could click plus and we could call it delay duration, or we can right click on this pin and you can see this promote to variable. If I click on that, it's going to automatically create a variable and I'm going to call this delay duration. And it's also going to connect it up for me right away, which is just kind of nice. So that's a nice thing to know. Okay, and I can just take that and I can copy this and I can feed this in to each of my delays now, so that we've now variabilized our stuff. If we compile, we default to 1, that's fine, but if I wanted it to be a 1.5 delay, I could do that, I could change it, and now there'll be a longer delay between each of the house builds. The other thing that you can do that's worth knowing about is, much in the same way we made a vector here, we could also, there is the ability to convert these pins. So if I disconnect this, I can split this pin. And this will allow me to control each of the individual axes right here on the input. So I could feed this in directly to each of these on the node. This is just a good thing to know. It's generally, I would say generally, I don't work like that a ton. There are times where you need to split the pin in order, for example, it's very common when you're getting the hit info, like if a character gets hit, you'll get information back in the hit result. And the thing that you need from the hit result is just one of it, like the character that hit, for example. Rather than getting it and breaking all, you could just right click, split the struct, and take what you need as an example. So it's good to know that this is possible. All right, so that wraps up our variables course. We talked about what a variable is, the scientific definition, which is we threw out right away, and hopefully our bucket analogy is a little bit easier to wrap your heads around. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be doing some workbooks. There are some other cool things about variables that are worth knowing, especially based on certain types. So for example, I know we're doing workbooks on booleans and vectors. If there is another variable type that you've run into problems with, you think it would be potentially useful to do a quick little workbook addendum, we'll just add as many as you all think are helpful and useful. If you are new to visual scripting and Unreal, we'd love to hear how this tutorial went for you, what you thought of it. If you are a guru, as always, you think there's better ways we could have presented something, you took the time to watch this, thank you, let us know, hit us with the feedback, that would be great. And as always, if you like this content and you want us to keep doing this, you know the drill. Spread the word, support the channel in the ways that you know best. If there are different other content that you would like us to work on or spend time developing, again, by all means, let us know. We'll see you soon for the next class. Thanks for checking out the video. Take it easy.